Okay, I went a little bit longer than I expected to on genetics. I think I always do. And I know the last couple semesters I've left out evolution because we were behind. And I saw in the interests that I think someone, at least one, maybe two people said they were interested in evolution. So I'm going to include what I feel like I need to. And I'm going to try to move on to brain development, the very first part of brain development today. But we might not get there. So I'm making this early slide as just I'm going to hope that I get to brain development, but I might not. I almost always start with this bit from Darwin about functionalism and the inheritance of traits and some of what he said in the Descent of Man in his evolutionary theory. So, which much of psychology comes from, and not just this kind of biological psychology, but the people who were first creating this field were very much influenced by Darwin, who had really just written this Descent of Man and Origin of Species in those books. But Darwin's theory is that all of the characteristics of an organism have some functional significance, that they had some adaptive function that helped us to survive and reproduce. And so this process by which inherited traits that increase an animal's likelihood to survive and reproduce will gradually become more prevalent in a population. And I started alluding to that with with the genetics and epigenetics, but and mutations, and we're going to get back into that kind of explanation and those concepts as we talk about natural selection. This also means that inherited traits, so if I inherit something that decreases my likelihood of surviving and reproducing, that trait will become less prevalent in a population. So your author makes this distinction that is very important, that most of us know what kind of breeding looks like from artificial selection, where we choose uh, the individuals that have the desired traits or the traits that we're looking for, and we make them the parents of the next generation. And I can't remember what other class I put my sensation and perception class, if you were in that class too, I went and looked up pictures of dogs in that class, as well as you might notice that I miss my dogs. And if you want to look at the one down at the bottom right, I had a blue tick coonhound. They're very bred. Those hunting dogs are bred because they make good hunters. And it depends on what you're hunting, what kind of hunting dog you most likely want. According to Darwin, nature also does its own selection. So successful individuals, it's their genes that are going to be more prevalent in later generations, and that's natural selection. And every time I talk about natural selection and functionalism, so that whatever we are seeing passed on in a species was functional in some way and adaptive in some way. That's why they inherited these traits. I always come to butterflies because I really like butterflies, and I like having pictures of butterflies pretty much as I like having pictures of dogs on my slides. So this is the owl butterfly, and it has a number of aspects of it that make it very likely to survive and reproduce. One, you might notice the color and the kind of overall pattern of it, that if its wings are closed up and it's on the trunk of a tree, it is camouflaged. It looks just like the part of the trunk of the tree. Okay, but now if it does have a bird, so a bird of prey for the butterfly is approaching, this butterfly will open up its wings, and you'll see these owlets, these little parts of the butterfly that mimic the eyes of an owl, which is a predatory bird that preys on other birds. So usually the bird will fly away. So it has a number of features that have made it more likely to survive and reproduce, and those features have been passed on. I almost always, when I'm doing this too, talk about the viceroy butterfly. You can tell I really like butterflies. That has it has evolved to the extent of that it looks exactly like, its markings are almost exactly like the monarch butterfly. And the monarch butterfly is poisonous to animals, and so animals learn to avoid the monarch butterflies. They eat this milkweed that makes them poisonous, but viceroy butterflies, they aren't themselves poisonous, but because they look just like monarch butterflies, other animals avoid them. So again, that kind of inheriting this trait that is going to make it likely that you will survive and reproduce. Reproducing is an important part of that. Okay, so I'm gonna repeat some of what I've already done, but in the context of the evolution of behavior. So I'm doing it very quickly. So if you have questions, you can ask me. But we've gone over this these next couple of slides, but it's introducing some of these aspects of what's happening with evolution and this passing down of genetics. Every sexually reproducing multicellular organism has a large number of cells, each of which are containing those chromosomes. Those chromosomes, we can see changes, are made up of genes, and we can see genetic change in several ways. And I've gone through this again with talking about heredity, that we can see these mutations in the genes where there's a heritable change in the genetic information. And I've talked before about microduplications and microdeletions. To some extent, I'm going to leave that behind. We're just going to, the important part for discussing evolution is to really understand that we have genetic mutations. Some of those mutations are going to provide a selective advantage for an individual, where that individual produces more than average number of offspring of its species. Okay, and this is, and then, so the offspring are also, if they're getting this mutation and making them likely to produce more than average. Okay, so that makes that mutation, that change in genetics, likely to be passed down to future generations and become more prevalent in future generations. Mutations that are not deleterious, that are not hurting us, also get passed on and they provide variability so that we have variability in our species, making it such that if environment changes, we have this variability such that some might be likely to be adaptable to that, more able to adapt to that new environment. So this variability is also key. And I've put a couple of pictures from other textbooks that I'm not going to really walk us through, except to say that, you know, starting back in this one, it looks like 326 million years ago, and looking at our ancestors and then who split off from whom, and then our sort of common ancestors. And then as we're moving up into the one on the right, we're at 60 million years ago, so at the very, very top of the picture on the left, and we can look at how related we are to orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees especially. We share something like, if I remember the percentage correctly, it's 98.8% of our DNA with the chimpanzee. And this process of evolution, the point of these pictures is not to memorize a bunch of who we're related to and how, but which I used to do a little bit of, but to show that this is a very gradual change in the structure of the physiology of plant and animal species as a result of natural selection. This is slow. It happens over something like, as a new species can evolve after something like 1,000 generations. So this is over long periods of time. And so I wanted to do that as part of the introduction to the first of these common misunderstandings that your author walks through. And I almost didn't do these, but I think they are common misunderstandings about evolution. One is that we have this kind of Lamarckian evolution instead of Darwinian evolution, where again, that Darwinian evolution takes generations and generations. It's a gradual process of natural selection. And Lamarckian evolution, when people use it, I feel like they're more talking about the evolution, like the evolving self, the evolution of individuals within their own lifetime, but not the evolution of species. Lamarckian evolution has this idea that the use or disuse of some structure or behavior causes an increase or decrease in that behavior, respectively. So if I'm using, I think he gives the example of the little toe, if I'm using the little toe somehow, that it increases the likelihood that my children and their children are going to have a small toe. But because we're not using our little toe, it's likely that we're going to lose that structure. And that's not really how this works. We have a little toe. It doesn't have any influence on on whether or not we survive. So using or disusing some structure isn't going to influence the genetics that I pass on. Another common misunderstanding is that humans have stopped evolving, and this partly comes from the fact that we have this really advanced medicine that most people can survive now to adulthood. We used to lose a lot of people, not just in infancy, but during childhood. But this again, regardless, there are a couple of misconceptions here, and one is that and I don't know how to word the first one, that this means some kind of change in what we can see passed down. And part of this, I think, is really what your author brings up, that if it's not just about surviving, it's about reproducing, right? So it's really important, the members of the species that are reproducing, because they are the ones that their genes are becoming more prevalent in future generations. Another common misunderstanding about evolution is that evolution means improvement. It doesn't mean improvement in, well, even I think the word improvement is so ambiguous as far as what we mean. What evolution causes is fitness. Fitness for being able to survive and reproduce in whatever environment that we are in. And the final one that he walks through is that evolution acts to benefit the individual or the species, but it's certainly not benefiting specific individuals. That's not what evolution is doing. And it's not even really about benefiting the species. What's benefiting from evolution is the genes themselves. What are the genetics that are becoming more prevalent in a population, in a species? Okay, so now I've smushed my 5 or 6 evolutionary psychology slides into one so that I could talk about altruism at the end, because I owe you all 2 minutes and I'm not giving it back, but I'm not going to go too much beyond what I am supposed to. So this evolutionary psychology has come along, and it focuses on functional and evolutionary explanations of how behaviors have evolved. It assumes that behavioral characteristics of species have arisen through this natural selection. And we're going to look at here some clearly very physical aspects of what's been passed on. And I'm just going to choose one, the evolution of color vision. And then I'm going to say that, so these behaviors, when we think about them as behaviors, remember that this is the brain is the physical form that is giving us those behaviors. But in this example of color vision, so at some point species had 2 cones. Most mammals do. And there was a species of New World monkey that, or what became New World monkeys, that they had this mutation in one of their cones, and they had 3 cones. And that gave those individuals a survival advantage because they could see a larger range of colors and they could better see not as much so much their predators as which was also they could better see, but they could better see the their food, and so they were better able to survive. And in fact, one of these New World monkeys, they have they have slightly different mutations in their cones than we do, and what they see the best, okay, is ripe bamboo versus not ripe bamboo, which is the specific food that they eat. So you can see how specific this is to this natural selection of the species. And for us, for humans, we've evolved these large brains. They helped us to survive and reproduce. And it's not just, what's important is not just that the brains are larger, but that we have the complex neural circuitry that allows for modification based on experience. So this gives us a better ability to learn from experience. And it's not just the larger brains, but the larger prefrontal cortex. So this is really important for what makes human species unique. And this allows us, right, as I mentioned with the frontal lobes in neuroanatomy, that this allows us the ability to plan, think about our future, think about other people, regulate, inhibit our impulses, regulate our emotional expressions, outbursts, whatever, and have those somatic markers so that I can recognize that this behavior might cause me or somebody else to be in pain or unhappy in the future, and so that's going to tell me not to perform this particular behavior. So that is what has part of what has evolved in people, where our behaviors again come out of this physical form of the brain. Okay, I think I owed you all 2 minutes if I remember correctly. I don't think I made that up on Wednesday. But someone did ask about altruism, and I really just want to finish so that I can start development after the exam. So he discusses altruism a little bit, and I'm going to try and keep it short because I to some extent disagree with some of what he's saying. This idea of group selection, he distinguishes between group selection and kin selection, where group selection, they're both kind of controversial hypotheses because we just don't have evidence that we can get about a lot of this evolutionary stuff. We don't have evidence. We have conjecture and what logically makes sense from what we can see. But the group selection is a hypothesis that's stating that altruistic groups are going to survive better than less cooperative groups, and especially as we are social species and we depended on each other, and especially in those hunter-gatherer times, that this makes some sense. But what's more plausible is kin selection, because if I'm altruistic and helping out my relatives, then that is beneficial for the genetics, right, for passing on those particular genes, which again is what evolution is really about. He also and I have the meerkats on there as they are, they seem to have this real altruistic society for themselves. And then there's the idea of reciprocal altruism, this idea that if I help, if there's an individual who's helping other people, that other people will return the favor of helping that individual. And so part of this altruism that we see is somebody building a reputation for helpfulness so that other people will cooperate and help them. But that only works if the other people are willing to help and cooperate with you. But I'm gonna throw one thing in here that I'm gonna throw a couple of short things in here. So in one of my textbooks there was just an example of altruism, as how they addressed altruism, and I was looking for the picture, but I couldn't find it. But so somebody in New York City was waiting for the train, and an epileptic person had a seizure and fell onto the train tracks. And this person, so a stranger, okay, this person dove onto the the train was coming. He dove onto the epileptic person and held that person down so that they could both go between the wheels of the train. So he saved that person's life at risk, at true risk of his own, and without any real benefit from the future, as these were strangers that were around him. And I think that that kind of altruism is important to pay attention to, that this isn't something where we necessarily are altruistic in order to gain something back all the time. And this decision of his had to be so instinctual and quick that I just don't think this whole, I'm building a reputation for helpfulness, but perhaps some of that is put into, again, into our genetics, and it varies. I'm just going to throw in one more thing, that if you look at some of the, so you might have noticed, and I try to put pictures of animals on here as much as possible. I'm a real animal lover, and there are several, and I'm going to give two examples, but there are many, many examples like this, like Owen and MZ. If I'm remembering correctly, this was a tortoise, might have been a turtle, who came upon a baby hippo, or the baby hippo was next to the tortoise, and the tortoise really brought up the baby hippo. And you can also go look up Coco the gorilla, who is very protective of a kitten that they give to her. So this kind of altruism goes across species, and clearly that's not selecting not only for the genetics of my species or the genetics of my family or my genes, but for some other species altogether. And where this comes from, I think, is much more complicated than anything I've really seen discussed, because we do see these examples of cross-species altruism.